Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sexual Assault Victim Advocate Fundamentals training series. Today's presentation is on the intersection between human trafficking and sexual assault. Before we begin, I would like to provide a sensitive subject matter warning for today's content. Today's training may include sensitive subject matter that may cause participants to experience strong emotional reactions. We encourage you to take care of yourself during today's training and reach out to your support networks for help if needed. I'll be putting some reminders in the chat, and with that, I will turn it over to our presenter for her to introduce herself. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of your training series. As Melissa said, this specific training is going to be on the intersection of human trafficking and sexual assault. My name is Mac Bowles, and I am the Human Trafficking Legal Specialist here at MCASA. So, like Melissa mentioned, we are going to be talking about some sensitive stuff in this training. It's a longer training as well. Some of the things we're going to talk about might be uncomfortable language or uncomfortable information. We're going to be going over a story as part of like our activity for this training that's based on the experiences of real
Okay, so
trafficked survivors.
let me ask you this.
And
When I call my
so
insurance company, I tell them to put you.
So please feel free, right, to excuse yourself at any point, take a break, go step outside, whatever you need to do to make sure you're taking care of yourself. If you're just tired of my voice, like go ahead and step out and take a break. It's a long one. You'll also notice that throughout the training, I'll be using words. I'll either be using victim, survivor, or individual kind of interchangeably. I've worked with trafficked individuals who hate the word survivor, who hate the word victim, who, don't like either of them, right? And so kind of just using those to get a sense of, right, like everything is going to be dependent on your individual interactions with survivors. All of the stuff, right? I'm not saying things like to just be traumatic, right? I promise they're all for a purpose. And yeah, just take care of yourself, step out if you need to, and we will go ahead and get started. So this training is separated into two parts. The first part of the training is focused more on theory, so defining terms and understanding the basic facts about human trafficking. And then the second part of the training is going to focus more on the practical aspect of actually working with survivors in the field. So the training objectives for part one, by the end of this section, you should be able to define human trafficking and clearly differentiate between sex and labor trafficking, provide at least one example of what force, fraud, and coercion look like, identify and debunk at least 3 common myths or misconceptions about human trafficking, explain the intersection of human trafficking with sexual assault and domestic violence, and describe the current scope of human trafficking both nationally and in Maryland. So starting off with the basics, really. What is human trafficking? So the next few slides are going to be a number of true or false statements. Just to get a basic, kind of get our brains going and get a basic understanding of what everybody already knows about human trafficking, maybe spark a little bit of critical thought about what current biases exist in relation to human trafficking. And we are going to be using the poll function, which Alyssa is going to help me out in pulling up. And we will start now. So the first statement is human trafficking can occur without any form of transportation or movement from one location to another. All right. Looks like we have a couple false. So this is actually true, right? So human trafficking might include transportation, and oftentimes it does. For example, you may see a trafficker moving individuals from county to county. or in the case of Maryland, because we're such a small state, from state to state in order to maximize profit and avoid detection, but it doesn't require it. Human trafficking also occurs, and I'll probably say this a couple different times, really does occur in the towns, the neighborhoods, and the homes of survivors. And it's important to note that trafficking via online forums, such as camming, don't necessarily require any transportation at all. Okay, moving on to the next statement. If an individual kept some of the money from performing a commercial sex or labor act, they weren't a victim of trafficking. All right. Most of you got this one. So this one is false. Many survivors do actually keep some of the money that they make while being trafficked, but they do so under the control of another individual. For example, a trafficker may control a person's bank account, or a survivor may only have enough to pay for basic necessities while still being indebted to a trafficker via something like a quota system. So receiving money for survival or necessities doesn't make the exploitation consensual. And I think we, as a society, have had a hard time understanding that. But traffickers often use this type of partial pay to create more dependency. Okay. Next statement. Sex trafficking always involves the exchange of money. That's what makes the crime unique. All right. This is false. So the exchange can include money, but it doesn't have to. And oftentimes it really doesn't. Um, I think that people often get tripped up by the word commercial in Commercial Sex Act, thinking only about the exchange of money. But it's simply the exchange of um, a specific sex act for anything of value to that individual survivor. So this can often be seen in the form of things like food or clothes or drugs are a really big one. Protection. I've seen it be something as little as like a vape, right? Or a bag of chips. All right. Next one. A person is still considered a survivor of human trafficking even if they initially consent to engage in risky or illegal behavior. Awesome. Okay. This is true. So, what occurs before the force, fraud, or coercion come into play really doesn't have any bearing on if what is happening is trafficking or not. So, the act of trafficking should always and is dictated by the trafficker's conduct and not the conduct of the survivor. So survivors often engage in things like survival sex or selling drugs or petty theft out of desperation. And this makes them more vulnerable to trafficking. Um, I think this might seem obvious to this group of individuals, but based on my experience, society will often look at this and blame the survivor more times than they're ever going to blame the buyer or the trafficker. So it's very common, right, to put this blame on the individual who is experiencing the trafficking. All right. In our final statement, if a person has the power to leave but chooses to stay, the situation doesn't meet the technical definition of human trafficking. Most of you got this one as well. This is false. So many survivors appear to choose to stay, but they're really doing so under a lot of different coercive and manipulative factors. Survivors may have options in theory, right, to leave, but face real and extreme consequences if they actually do, such as threats to themselves or their children, fear of deportation or being caught up with law enforcement, having no viable housing or employment opportunities. And then, of course, we also have to recognize that many survivors have trauma bonds with their traffickers, right? They love them or they respect them or they don't want to get them into trouble. Okay. Thank you all for participating in the polls. Moving right along. Okay. So I'm not going to really read out the specific definitions of each. You all are going to get a PDF of this PowerPoint to, do some more reading if you would like. But just to give you kind of a general understanding of the human trafficking movement or the anti-human trafficking movement. So before 2000, human trafficking was not clearly defined in federal law. Cases involving things like forced labor and sex trafficking were typically prosecuted under unrelated statutes like prostitution or kidnapping or other racially charged acts like the Mann Act. It was thought of something that happened abroad, right? This happens over there, but it doesn't happen here in America. And these types of approaches for prosecution really didn't offer any formal recognition or protections for survivors. And the term trafficking was, and still to this day, can quite honestly be used inconsistently across the nation. Um, Human trafficking was formally criminalized in the United States in the year 2000 with the passage of the Trafficking Victims and Protection Act, or the TVPA. Some of you might have heard of it. This both defined human trafficking for the first time and also acknowledged survivors as victims of crime deserving of protection and services. Under US law, human trafficking has generally been categorized into these two primary forms. So we have sex trafficking on one side, and then we have labor trafficking on the other. Sex trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion for commercial sex acts or any such act involving a minor. And we'll go a little bit more into depth on these as we continue throughout the presentation. And then labor trafficking involves forced labor, debt bondage, or involuntary servitude in any industry or setting. So at the state level, Maryland codified sex trafficking into its criminal code in 2007. However, it wasn't until 2019 that labor trafficking was also formally added to Maryland's criminal code. I say these dates, 2000, 2007, and 2019, really to put into perspective how new all of this is, right? I was a early 1990s baby, right? So there was a time, right? I was alive during a time when trafficking wasn't even recognized as a crime, right? Survivors weren't even recognized as victims. And so this is all very new stuff. There have been a lot of mistakes in the past made and continue to be made, but it kind of puts it into perspective, I think, in relation to other types of crimes. So MCASA, we focus predominantly on sex trafficking. However, I really want to make a note that vulnerability to one type of trafficking creates a vulnerability to the other type of trafficking. And I have worked with a number of survivors who have been both labor and sex trafficked, both at the same time and sometimes at one point or at another, right? Being labor trafficked in the day and sex trafficked at night. And so as sexual assault victim advocates, right, there is a lot of sexual violence that is happening in cases of labor trafficking that we don't really talk about enough of. So important to put out there. Okay. So one of the best ways to really understand or break down the different components of what trafficking is to use this act means purpose model. So act being what the trafficker did, means being how the trafficker did it. So that's going to be your force, fraud, or coercion. And then purpose. So why the trafficker did it. And that's either going to be for sexual exploitation and forced sex acts or sex trafficking or labor trafficking through forced labor and things like debt repayment. So you'll see this kind of little addendum under the means section that says not necessary for minors involved in sex trafficking. So when we are looking at a case of sex trafficking that involves a minor, it is not necessary to show force, fraud, or coercion. You only need to have the act and the purpose for it to be sex trafficking when a minor is involved. So I also kind of wanted to go in a little bit of detail about what these words mean, right? So the or in there is for a specific purpose. You do not need all three of these to make a case for human trafficking. You only need one to exist, right? And in the case of minors, you need none of them to exist, right? You just need the act and purpose. So kind of going through the different ones here. And if y'all will humor me, maybe do a little bit of engagement here in the chat section. So looking at force, right, which is probably the most common, the most easily understood form of control. So using physical power or threats of violence to control someone. So in the chat, can you all think of what force might look like in a trafficking situation? Yep, threatening close family, kidnapping, threatening harm to a loved one or to the person themselves, physical harm, physical restraint. Absolutely. Yep. Housing, right? Locking someone up, using weapons, right? Using maybe a gun or a bat or all of these different things. Awesome. The use of weapons. Yep. Okay. Great. Okay, so moving on to the next type, which is going to be your fraud. So lying or tricking someone to get them into a situation they didn't agree to. Can y'all think of what fraud might look like in a trafficking situation? Promising a job. Yep. Signing a contract they don't understand. Absolutely. Promising something, right? Withholding money. Weaponizing language barriers. Promising love and relationship. A huge one. Promising financial stability. Withholding documents. Also another huge one. This is great. Threatening to blackmail. This is all great. Promising safety. So our final one, and I think maybe the one that is a little bit more difficult to understand, is coercion, right? So coercion works by making someone feel like they have no choice but to comply, even if they're not physically restrained or locked up. So what can y'all think of any examples of what coercion might look like in a trafficking situation? No one will love you. Yep. Slut shaming. Grooming. Yep. Absolutely. Do this or else. Threatening to expose. You're all alone. Isolating them. If you do blank, I'll do blank. Exposing pictures, right? Gaslighting. Love that. Threatening to deport or call ICE. Threatening to call law enforcement, right? Outing them. Absolutely. Creating another big one, right, is creating dependency on drugs and then withholding them. Super, super common. Telling them nobody cares about you. Yeah, this is all great. Thank you all for participating. Okay. So what does it look like, right? So when you're kind of out in the field and you're working, how is this going to, what does the landscape look like? And so I kind of separated this into 6 different big categories. They're not mutually exclusive. So you could, for instance, have a familial trafficker who's doing it via an online platform, right? Or you could have an intimate partner who is also an employer, right? And so these don't necessarily fall into strict lines, but this is kind of like a broad overview of what you're likely to see. So the first type is going to be your pimp or handler controlled. This is one of the most commonly portrayed types of sex trafficking. And this is when there's a single trafficker who exerts control over one or more individuals. Then you're going to have what is your gang or group trafficking. And this is where the trafficking occurs from more of a network of multiple perpetrators and not a single individual, like a handler. Um, this can be particularly seductive for youth because oftentimes it provides a sense of group belonging or stability that they're not necessarily getting at home or within their own communities. The next one is going to be employer and recruiter. I think this one most commonly is associated with labor trafficking, but doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Victims are often exploited for work under coercive conditions in different industries like agriculture or construction or domestic work. And many victims, like we said in the last slide, right, initially believe that they're entering into a legitimate job opportunity. The next one is familial. So this is when a family member, often a parent or guardian, exploits a child or relative for financial gain. This can look like money, right? Or it can also look like rent. Or drugs is a very, very big one when we're talking about the trafficking of very young children. This is a form of trafficking that is underreported, but very, very common. More common than you probably think that it would be. Victims oftentimes themselves don't even recognize that they're being trafficked because the abuse is occurring in this caregiving context, right? Like they take care of me, they put a roof over my head, is it really that bad that I have to do this, right? Or I'm just helping mom out, right? Or I'm just helping the family out to make it through this tough time. The next one is going to be your intimate partner trafficking. Also one that is really, really, really prevalent. So this is when the trafficker is a romantic or domestic partner who uses manipulation, love, violence, right, isolation to maintain control. You see a lot of overlap here with circumstances of domestic violence, and it's a common method of recruitment, right, for individuals. So you start off as an intimate partner, right? You start off in a relationship and it morphs into human trafficking. And then finally, we have our online facilitated trafficking, right? And this includes trafficking that begins or is entirely carried out online through platforms like apps or webcams and things like that. This type of exploitation really, really blew up during COVID and has not slowed down since. It's increasingly common, especially among minors. And it's one of the more common ways that boys get wrapped up into a trafficking situation. Okay, so looking at the scope of human trafficking, what numbers we have. So estimates to the extent of human trafficking in the US, I've heard a wide range, right? From as little as 5,000 to as high as like 25 million. And I would say it's probably likely on the higher end of this. But these are the numbers that we have from like our national human trafficking hotline. I do think it's important to recognize when looking at the scope of human trafficking that we've, as a society, right, as victim service providers, have largely failed at addressing or even identifying a human trafficking and properly supporting survivors. So statistics, provide us really only like a snapshot of what's actually happening, like a little kind of window into what's occurring, although it's much, much larger than what we are actually seeing. I really like this specific image because it shows kind of the range of different types of trafficking or how this might show up. So you have really common forms, right, that come from things like escort services, illicit massage businesses, or your outdoor solicitation, which I think are ones we might think of more often. And then a little bit further down, you might see some stuff that maybe you hadn't thought about before, right? Like we have landscaping down there, carnivals, recreational facilities, things of that nature. One that I do really want to highlight, if you look about halfway down, There is a specific category in green that says illicit activities. So human trafficking through forced criminality occurs when an individual is coerced or threatened or manipulated into committing illegal acts for the benefit of a trafficker. This can often look like, right, our prostitution, maybe selling drugs, maybe theft, maybe fraud, right? Um, and traffickers gain more control over the individual because that individual is being forced to engage in something illegal. And traffickers know, and essentially the world has, history has proven them correct, that exposure to these types of crimes are going to lead to the criminalization of the survivors and not them. Okay, so trafficking in Maryland. Maryland has kind of always been a hub for trafficking. There are a couple of different reasons for that. So Maryland is in this really strategic position along the I-95 corridor, which runs, I think, all the way from Florida up to Maine. And it connects us to these really big major cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And we're also bordered by 4 states and DC, right? We have a lot of these different touch points with a lot of different places. It's very easy. Like, right, you can move from one side of Maryland to another, right? Maximum 5 hours, we're talking. And we also, because we are at this kind of epicenter of all of these different places, we have a lot of very active transportation hubs, right? We have 3 major airports that are by us, 2 of which are international. Baltimore specifically, right? We have the shipping ports of Baltimore. We have a bunch of truck stops. We have a bunch of these high traffic spaces. So these hubs are frequently exploited by survivors for moving victims from place to place, but also, right, they bring in a lot of fresh purchasers because we're in this very unique position. All right, so looking at trafficking vulnerabilities, all of these risk factors make an individual more vulnerable to trafficking. It's probably not surprising to anyone that a lot of these factors are the same ones that make an individual vulnerable to sexual assault. And I highlight prior abuse and neglect in the middle there, because this directly correlates to the work you'll be doing as a victim advocate. And also, like, we have to understand that these risk factors don't happen in a vacuum. They intersect and they compound on one another. And so the more risk factors that one has, the more vulnerable someone is to trafficking. So just kind of as a thought experiment, and you don't have to put anything in the chat, but just to keep our minds kind of running and working. How many of you know someone who has blamed or condemned another person for falling into one of these categories? I know a big one that we're seeing these days, citizenship status, right? If you didn't do it the legal way, then it really doesn't matter. You're a criminal. Mm. Or poverty is another big one, right? We're always blaming people for being in poverty. Can think of one for nearly all of them. Absolutely, right? Which is like powerful to think about, right? Sorry about that. I think it's important to remember that society has always really been a bystander that sees trafficking as the fault of the survivor and therefore not worthy of assistance, right? We, as a society, have really created a climate that has allowed trafficking to thrive. All right. So all of the data that we've collected from all of these big national organizations really confirms that most traffickers are not these shadowy figures that are pulling kids off of streets and into vans. They are more often than not people that the survivor knows, and oftentimes people that the survivor even loves and respects, right? They're shadowy or invisible, not because they're hiding, but really because our own biases won't allow us to think of the individuals who are trafficking as traffickers, right? So these first top 3 blue boxes are indicative of who your main traffickers are going to be across the board, right? It's going to be employers, it's going to be family members, and it's going to be intimate partners. I cannot tell you how many survivors I have worked with whose first trafficker was their mom, to a point where it's not even shocking or surprising to me anymore, right? It's just very common. A term that you might come across in the work that you're doing is a bottom. So a bottom is a victim who has been elevated by the trafficker to a position of relative authority over other victims. So they're oftentimes the ones who are acting like the enforcer. They're oftentimes the ones recruiting, right? Or managing the day-to-day operations of, a trafficking situation. They attract recruits by posing as friends or romantic partners and are often more unassuming and closer to the age of the survivor. They are by, say that, what is a bottom? So a bottom is essentially a victim who has been elevated by the trafficker to this position of power, right? So they're higher up on the food chain, and they then are the ones who are recruiting new individuals. They are, by legal definition, trafficking other individuals, right? But they are usually kept under the same coercive dynamics as survivors, other individuals, right? Or the people that they're recruiting. I bring this up because in your work, you may be working with a trafficked individual who really fits that ideal victim standard, right? But you also might be working with a bottom, right? Or individuals who have done things that you might not necessarily agree with. And there's a need to understand the moral complexity of trafficking and why working with traffickers can be really difficult for some people. Or trafficking survivors can be really difficult for some people. I think we all agree that trafficking is bad, but it can be quite difficult because it's not black and white, right? You're oftentimes in this very gray space. This gray moral space, right? I also want to highlight the prevalence of peer-to-peer trafficking. So this can happen, and I don't necessarily think it always happens in a malicious way, right? This can happen just because a classmate or a coworker who is currently being trafficked thinks that they're helping their friend out to earn some extra money, right? Think they have a good thing going. These individuals might not recognize that they're being trafficked to start with, right? It's coming from somebody that they trust. They might have initially agreed to engage in the activity. And then, grooming is this really slow incremental process that takes autonomy away little by little. So it can be very, very common. And we're seeing that it's also a very, very common way that boys are drawn into trafficking situations, specifically boys. And then also, I think it's just important to point out that minors can be traffickers as well, right? Traffickers are, range this wide array of different type of people that we usually don't think of when it comes to what a trafficker might look like. Recruiters are often the same age or close in age to the individuals that they're trying to recruit. So the cases that you might come across are likely going to be complex and nuanced and a little bit difficult to navigate. And they're probably going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable and push against some biases or worldviews that we all have, right? Society has, put it into us. But just because you don't understand something or don't necessarily agree with something that a client you're working with has done doesn't make the situation any less important to address and doesn't impact the fact that trafficking has occurred. Okay, so just a little bit about recruitment. So recruitment and grooming happens all around us, even in places that our minds really tell us should be these safe and monitored spaces. So in the community, we're talking about your schools. We're talking about parks, maybe not malls. I don't know if people go to malls anymore. But your churches, right? I want to highlight shelters and group homes, right? Places where you have an isolated group of very vulnerable individuals. These are places that are often targeted, right? I want to highlight detentions, prisons, and jails, right? Another place where you have extremely vulnerable, isolated individuals. And we know that when you come out of jail, right? When you come out of prison, what your options for housing and employment are going to be extremely limited. And so this makes them very, very lucrative recruiting grounds for individuals. And then, of course, we have the internet and the home, right? We have familial trafficking. And again, I want to, reiterate, right, that this happens way more than we want to think that it does, happening from the home. And also, right, like these traffickers aren't taking individuals, right? They're not grabbing them off the street, right? They are exploiting these unmet needs and these desperations and these systemic failures, right? To recruit and control individuals. These are people who are looking for basic needs. They're looking for belonging, some sense of stability. And this is what the traffickers are providing, right? They are providing these things for them. So working in this space, I think, right, in my experience, is really just as much about unlearning things that you've been told about trafficking as it is about learning new things. Okay, so we are going to do a little activity. Alyssa is going to put in the chat a little PDF document, and I'll give you guys a chance to open that up. We're going to run through a story, Jasmine's story, which is based on the experiences of real trafficking survivors. I want to give you all a minute to open it up. And if y'all want to throw like a thumbs up or something in the chat, so I know that you guys have it open, and are able to access it. I agree, Alexis, with what you're saying about COVID and the uptick, right? And right, this loss of space, this loss of community, right? I think we forget how much of a protective factor community is. Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. And I'm gonna have a little recording that's gonna, it's my voice, sorry. Other parts of the story are gonna be other people's voices, so you get a little break from mine. But just like read along or listen along or whichever is easiest for you. Jasmine is a 15-year-old girl living in a small rural community in Maryland. Her father, who overstayed a seasonal visa, is often absent due to long hours working in agriculture. Jasmine's mother struggles with substance use and has difficulty keeping a job. At one point, Jasmine and her mother stayed with the man who offered them a place to live when they couldn't afford rent. During that time, Jasmine was sexually abused by the man. When Jasmine disclosed this to her mother dismissed the abuse, saying, "That happens sometimes, and we have a good thing going here. Don't mess it up." Jasmine frequently misses school. When she does attend, she finds it hard to keep up with the material and often feels lost in class discussions. She has always struggled with reading. Despite her academic challenges and chronic absences, there's been no follow-up or support from the school. If a teacher ever notices her, it's because she's doing something wrong. Jasmine doesn't really have any friends. She is often bullied by peers for her appearance, particularly for wearing the same clothes repeatedly. She's frequently involved in verbal and physical altercations, often as a response to being provoked or mistreated by others. Jasmine has attempted to run away multiple times. Each time, she's returned home. Sometimes she steals from her mother's drugs when she wants an escape from her life. Recently, Jasmine was charged in juvenile court for substance use after being caught by the police. All right. So based on what we have heard and read about Jasmine's story, what are some of the risk factors that you think makes Jasmine vulnerable to trafficking? And I'll pop it up to these risk factor pages to make it a little bit easier. Lack of parental presence or involvement. Mom isn't on our side. Housing. Absolutely. Poverty, disability, potentially neurodivergent, right? Socioeconomic status, citizenship, a great one. We don't know, right? If she has citizenship status. Age, she's young. Juvenile justice involvement, a huge one. Substance use, mental health, gender, all of this. Yes, this is great, y'all. Being in a rural area, absolutely. This is great. Okay. So why does all of this matter, right? Why are we going over this? Now that you have a basic understanding of trafficking, why does this matter to sexual assault victim advocates who aren't necessarily designated as advocates for trafficking survivors? So if you haven't guessed it by now, right, there is a lot of crossover between these different spaces, right? They are very, very, very much correlated to each other. And they are extremely interconnected. And vulnerability to one of these increases vulnerability to the other. And they can occur simultaneously, right? It's not like you have just domestic violence or just human trafficking, right? You might have a situation that is both. You might have a situation that is all three. So sex trafficking, while oftentimes more extreme and complex, is still a form of sexual violence, just like what happens in other situations. I think the main difference that we really see here is how survivors of human trafficking are treated. And that is not to say, right, we know that we don't treat domestic violence and sexual assault survivors appropriately. Like we know the system constantly fails them. I think the difference with human trafficking is not only do we not believe these survivors, but we oftentimes legitimately criminalize them. Okay. So you may be working with a client who has experienced a form of sexual violence, who has not yet been trafficked, but who is at a really high risk of being trafficked, which puts you in like a really unique position to like act as a preventative or a protective factor for these individuals. So the Polaris did this national survey study in 2023 that put out this like crazy statistic, saying that 84% of trafficking survivors reported experiencing sexual abuse in childhood. So many survivors of human trafficking have long histories of sexual abuse, and prior trauma correlates very, very strongly to trafficking. So they're very, very much interconnected. We also know that survivors of sexual assault often experience trauma, loss of self-worth. They isolate themselves, right? They might lose some support systems. You'll learn in a future training, right? A decrease to their economic stability, even. So these are all factors that traffickers exploit for recruitment and control. We also have very clear shared dynamics between both trafficking and domestic violence, right? That involve these long-term patterns of power and control. We are creatures of like habit, right? We are creatures of patterns, right? And so it's oftentimes, right, it's easy to move from one situation to another situation because it feels familiar to an individual, right? Also, we know that when trauma is left unaddressed, we transfer that onto the people around us, including our children, right? And so some survivors, right, may come to view exploitation as this means of survival, and it might have been something that their parents did as well, which leads to like these intergenerational patterns of harm, right? I've worked in situations where with survivors, right, spanning three generations, right? So the daughter, the mother, and the grandmother. And so it's really important that we're recognizing these things as well in our work. And then, of course, there's survival sex, which is extremely, extremely prevalent for youth in particular. Oftentimes they're engaging in this because let's be honest, right? There's a market for it. People will buy it, people will pay money for it. And it's a way to get money when you're in a state of instability, and which often leaves you vulnerable to different types of sexual assault or abuse. So during trafficking, I think most obviously, right, in the context of sexual violence, there is a lack of consent. Any sex act that is happening under coercion, force, or fraud can be classified as a sexual assault. I think sexual assault really happens constantly with trafficking by buyers or other co-survivors or traffickers. We just don't really see it as trafficking, right? That's the issue that we have. We blame these on them because maybe there was like this exchange of money. So we don't understand that maybe consent, right? This was forced, right? This was a forced situation, right? But there was a money exchange, right? I paid for this service, right? So I should get it, right? You accepted the money for this service or whatever the case might be. We also spoke about intimate partner trafficking. So this thing called the Romeo pimp, right? These are individuals who gain trust by pretending to be like a loving and protective partner. They're oftentimes really bringing these individuals outside of situations that are bad, right? It's not like they were in such great situations before, right? These are people who come across as protectors. And once they kind of establish this emotional dependence, um, they are able to manipulate this individual into selling sex, right? They oftentimes frame it as like helping the relationship, right? Or I need you to do this to prove your love, or like we really need the money, right? I'm out of work. If you could just do this one more time. So framing it as like something that is going to be temporary, involuntary, when the trafficker has no intention of it being either of those things. So just kind of, I won't speak too much on this, but just to give you like a sense of like why traffickers use sexual violence, some of the different ways that they use it in sex and labor trafficking. It's used like more often, right? It can be used for sexual gratification, right? That can be an option, but more often than not, it's about power and control, right? They use it to instill obedience, right? To normalize this type of abuse. So it becomes the regular day to day for an individual, to manipulate feelings of love, right? To punish when you do something wrong. And we also have these different types of sexual violence that you might see in your work as well, both within labor and sex trafficking. I think the one we think of the most, right, will be the sexual assault and rape by a trafficker or a buyer. But there's a myriad of different pieces, right? There's this threat of sexual violence to an individual or their family, right? Making survivors watch rape or assault. I've worked with a survivor who was forced to watch videos of rape and sexual torture as a child as a form of essentially grooming her to engage in commercial sex. This is more common, I think, than we like to think about. For things like forced nudity or humiliation and sexual torture, we're seeing this a lot with male survivors, right? Extreme instances of sexual torture or this type of humiliation. There's a growing market for it, in fact. Creating sexually explicit content, right? This can be for the purpose of a commercial sale, but also as a way to blackmail, right? To keep more control of an individual and to make sure that individual does what you want them to do. And then, of course, I think there's also the sexual assault or rape by other exploited individuals. I think if any of you have heard the saying, hurt people, it's the same, right? It's the same in these instances, right? When you experience such an extreme level of trauma, it's likely, right, that you are probably going to cause trauma to other individuals around you. So we already spoke about, right, like a bottom is a perfect example of something like that. All right, so we are going to continue on with Jasmine's story. If you guys want to reopen up or go back to your PDF, we are gonna push play here, listen along, read along, whatever works best for you.
A few months after Jasmine's release from juvenile detention, Jasmine's mother secures a month-to-month rental, but drug use and rent instability persist. One day, her mother tells Jasmine she needs to help by sleeping with the landlord to cover rent. He doesn't want the mother anymore. He is interested in Jasmine. She pressures Jasmine by saying, "I did the same when I was your age. You know that I love you, but if I get kicked out, you get kicked out too. I know you're not a virgin anyway." This arrangement continues for 3 months until one night the landlord breaks Jasmine's arm. Jasmine's mother takes her to a clinic to get looked at and insists on staying in the urgent care room to make sure Jasmine is comfortable. They go to this clinic a lot. When Jasmine refuses to continue sleeping with the landlord, her mother kicks her out. Jasmine moves in with a senior at her high school who has recently started showing her attention. He will sometimes buy her lunch, and he always compliments her. This is the first time a boy from school has shown any interest in her. He offers her a place to stay and tells her she can sleep in his room if she has nowhere else to go. He also tells her he can help her get some extra money if she lets him take a few photos and videos. He has done it before and he frames it as something simple and beneficial. It's easy money, and no one has to know. Jasmine thinks, I like him, and he is nice to me, and I also need the money. Jasmine shows up to school with bruises, but staff assume it's from fighting classmates.
All right. So, based on what we know about Jasmine's story up to this point, what are some instances or potential instances of sexual assault that you're seeing throughout this storyline? Survival sex, having sex with the landlord, absolutely. Abuse from the mom. Right. Her mother pimped her out, right? Sexual exploitation from the mom. Can, right? The boy, right? Do we know that she's sleeping in the same room as this boy, right? Do we know if they're sleeping in the same bed? Or like, is he touching her? We don't know these pieces. I think back to part one of the story, right? And when Jasmine was young and she was sexually abused by another individual. Does anybody see in this storyline maybe some instances of sexual violence or trauma that's happening to Jasmine's mother? Right? We know that her mom is asking for Jasmine to do these things, right? Survival sex with the landlord. He doesn't want the mom anymore, right? Which indicates that it probably happened to her. Mother perpetrates what she went through herself, right? She did this when she was young. This is great. How about anything potentially, right, about the boy from high school? Right? He says he's done it before. Do we know to who or why? Right? Was it done to other individuals? Was it done to him? We don't hear anything about his parents, right? Was he also potentially an individual who has been trafficked as well? We don't know, right? We don't know, maybe, right? And so I think it's interesting, right, that um, yes, Jasmine is a victim, but we also have all these other potential victimizations through sexual violence that are occurring throughout the story as well. That, right? People that we don't think of, things that we don't think of that we really need to be kind of, looking a little bit deeper at, right? It's definitely a possibility. People only do what they know. hmm So on its face, Jasmine's deal with the boy from high school seems consensual, right? We know that this is not necessarily the case. But would your opinion change, or do you think you know somebody whose opinion would change as to her consent or lack thereof if Jasmine was a 25-year-old in the story? Right? If Jasmine was Jacob instead, do you think it might be common for people to say of a 25-year-old, she's old enough to know better? Do you think a first instinct for a boy would be, well, he has the power to fight back, right? Age shouldn't matter, right? Gender shouldn't matter. But often, right? Oftentimes, it really, really does change people's opinion. Okay, this is great, guys. Thank you for participating. I love all the activity in the chat. Race, absolutely all of this. Yes, totally comes into play. Okay, so after trafficking, right? It's very common for an individual who is trying to exit the life, right, or come out of the life to be extremely vulnerable to future sexual assault and domestic violence or other traumatic relationships, right? Or even trafficking again, right? We have all of these systemic barriers to reentry. The majority of survivors that I have worked with have criminal records. They just do, right? And we can think about all the things that a criminal record hinders to your reentry, right? Jobs, employment, ability to get a loan, right? All of these things. So they're more likely to face coercive relationships or engage in survival sex post trafficking because it's really one of the only options that is available to them. We also have things like trauma bonding and these coercive patterns, right? We are creatures of habit. We go back to things because they feel familiar, right? It might seem crazy to an outsider, but if this is what you've done your whole life and this is what you know, it feels comfortable, right? It might feel familiar to fall back into these patterns of abuse. We oftentimes have extreme complex trauma and PTSD happening, right? Which leaves an individual, to isolate themselves, to have a really deep and internalized self-perception of hate and self-worth, right? I'm not going to get any better than this, right? Like this is my lot in life. Self-esteem is limited, absolutely. Lack of support systems. A lot of these individuals never, to be honest, right, to be real, never had them to begin with, right? Never had support systems to begin with. So they've never had really strong community support networks. And then there is the reality is there is a lot of stigma and blame, right? We blame and we criminalize survivors for the situations that they end up in. And it's something that we are right now, even engaging in this training, right, is really trying to break that down and make a difference. And as a sexual assault victim advocate, this sounds super awful, right? But I do think it is very true, right? As this type of advocate, you are likely working with someone who has been trafficked, who is being trafficked, or who is at risk of being trafficked in the future. It puts you in a very important position as well, right? Like you have the power to do a lot of good. All right, y'all, stay with me. We're moving on to part 2. We're halfway there, a little over halfway there. So for our second part, our training objectives, by the end of this part, you should be able to recognize at least 6 key red flags or indicators of trafficking. Identify at least 2 ways complex trauma may manifest in survivors of trafficking. List at least 2 do's when interacting with human trafficking survivors. And name at least 1 national and local resource for referral pathways available to survivors of trafficking. Okay. Identification and screening. What makes it hard? We've really kind of gone over this in bits and pieces, but here it is kind of laid out in a much more concrete way, right? This is an issue that is oversimplified. It's often misclassified, right? Which makes you as a sexual assault victim advocate, or maybe you're working in the domestic violence space, you are going to be likely the front line touch points for these individuals in terms of getting services, right? They're very rarely going to start off by going to human trafficking related resources. They're going to come through you all, right? Trafficking really is kind of happens in the midst of all these other crises and issues, and so it can get lost in them, right? And identifying trafficking really is not a surface level thing. It's really beneath the immediate crisis, which can be quite difficult when you're trying to provide services and crisis response. It's under-identified, right? We know that all of these racial, gender, and personal biases block us from seeing what is actually happening, right? But there's also confusion over the definition. We just spent like an hour talking about it, right? It's complex, it's complicated. And self-reporting is extremely rare, right? It's a lot of survivors may know that they've been mistreated, right, or taken advantage of, but they don't know that they might classify as a human trafficking survivor, right? It is often through the use of service provisions like sexual assault organizations that they're able to come to understand what's happened to them. And it can be like years, right? It could be a week, sure, but it could be years before a survivor even recognizes or allows themselves to recognize that what happened to them meets the legal definition of trafficking. And it's underreported for a variety of reasons. Survivors may not report due to shame. They may not report because of fear from their community, their family, What law enforcement, right? Potential deportation. They are oftentimes coming through the system in a way where they've engaged with social services, like they've engaged in many of them, and most of them have really minimized their pain or kind of, you know, seen them as a non-compliant individual and pushed them out of those services, right? And there's also love, right? We know that these traffickers provide a lot for these survivors in their minds, right? They're protecting them, right? They pulled them out of the situation. They don't want to get them in trouble. So indicators of trafficking. These are things I think that you can, part of this will come into sort of the questions that you're asking when you're working with a survivor within the realm of like your job description, right? We never want to like fish for information just for information's sake. We really want to make sure we're doing it for a purpose. But these are some things to be aware of, right? This is a non-exhaustive list of indicators. That could kind of point to the fact that, hey, maybe I should take a deeper look or take a step back and, go find a better resource to look into. So the first is going to be evidence of extended substance abuse. Substance dependency, is often forced or encouraged by traffickers as a means of control or coping. It's extremely common. The crossover happens all the time. And so this could be, right, that maybe you see track marks, right? Or maybe when you're going to the hospital with them to get a safe exam, the hospital staff knows and recognizes them because they come through a lot. Or when you're looking for programs for them, you find out that they have a history of program denial or removal based on addiction. The next would be if they're runaway and homeless youth or those who miss a bunch of school. So this is a population that is extremely targeted by traffickers due to their lack of stability and oversight. And these are youth who are often already engaging in survival behaviors that traffickers exploit. If you have a older or controlling partner or parent in the picture, right? There's a noticeable age gap between an individual and their partner. If there's signs of excessive control, right? Like the partner speaks for them, or you find out that the partner or the parent monitors their phone closely, this can be an indication. Are they living and working or is it a minor who is engaging in commercial sex acts? This immediately, right, is sex trafficking. We know there doesn't need to be force, fraud, or coercion. If this is happening, it should set something off in your mind, right, about what's going on. Are they living and working in the same place, right? Individuals who live where they work, their vulnerability to coercive control is exponentially increased, right? We can see this like, people maybe living above restaurants or massage parlors, right? Or farms, different things like that. Maybe asking, are they allowed to leave on their own, right? Do they have to check in with somebody when they go somewhere? Do they need permission to go to different places? Is there a lack of control of their money or financials or personal IDs? Survivors often don't have access to these documents, right? They're held by someone else, right? If you find out like, oh, I don't have these documents, someone holds them for me, right? Maybe they don't know what bank they go to, right? Or maybe they've never had a bank account. Maybe they say someone helps them with their money, right? All indications that maybe they don't have control over these pieces of their lives. If they're not sure where they are, right? If someone appears confused about their location, maybe what county or what city they're in, or maybe if they say, it doesn't really matter, I'll be leaving soon, I won't be here long. Could put a little bit of a red flag in your mind, like, something might be happening here. If there's a noticeable mismatch in what they have, right? So someone with unclean or cheap clothes or visible signs of neglect, but they have like multiple iPhones, or they have expensive accessories, or their nails and hair are done, right? But they have, bruising or seem to be maybe more emaciated. Is it winter and they're wearing a mini dress, right? All of these different kind of like mismatches where it doesn't quite sit right. And is there signs of prolonged abuse or branding, right? We want to look for bruises and injuries that are in various stages of healing. right? So abuse that is happening over an extended period of time, right? Are they super fearful or hyper vigilant, right? Are they like jumpy? Maybe a door opens and they jump, right? Or they startle very easily. Do they have very extreme fluctuations in their actions, right? In their reactions, right? They might be super, aggressive or angry. And then the next in 10 minutes later, they're very, calm and their face looks blank, right? Is there signs of malnourishment or fatigue, right? In terms of branding, I would say branding might be a little bit overblown in the media for sure, but it does happen, right? So a place you might see it, right? A very common place would be like on the neck that you might be able to visibly see. So things, maybe it's someone's name on the neck, right? Or like a crown or the name daddy, right? Or mommy on the neck. All right, moving right along with part 3 of Jasmine's story. Go ahead and, oh, oh no. All right, follow along, listen along, read along. Here we go.
As everything continues to spiral, Jasmine connects with an older man named Trevor on Instagram. He tells her he understands what she's going through and that all he wants is to take care of her. Within a month of talking online, Trevor says he loves her and invites her to come live with him in Baltimore. Desperate for a way out, Jasmine exchanges sex with a truck driver in return for a ride to the city. She'd learned that this was the safest way to leave town without being noticed. In the past, anytime she tried to take a bus when she ran away from home, security would call the police and she couldn't afford a ticket anyway. Once in Baltimore, Trevor treats her kindly at first. He takes her out on dates, buys her clothes, and showers her with affection. But that slowly starts to change. He becomes more controlling and aggressive with her, to the point where she doesn't.
Oh no. Sorry, guys.
And showers her with affection. But that slowly starts to change. He becomes more controlling and aggressive with her, to the point where she doesn't leave the apartment without permission. One day, he tells her he's lost his job and begins pressuring her to go on a few dates with other men to help pay the bills. He tells her, "If you love me, you do this for me, just until I get back on my feet." To cope, Jasmine starts using drugs again. Trevor provides them as long as she keeps going on dates. She's arrested several times for prostitution and drug possession, but she gives a fake name each time to avoid being identified.
All right. So based on what we know from Jasmine's story to this point, what are some of the systems that ignored or punished Jasmine when there were indications of trafficking present in her life? School. Yep. Huge one. Parents, right? Like her dad is rarely around. Absolutely. Clinic staff. Absolutely. Healthcare. Juvenile justice. Huge, right? We're talking a lawyer saw her, police officer saw her, a judge saw her, correctional officer saw her, right? All of these different people. Transportation workers. Absolutely. All of this. This is great. Even, if we think about the fact that she lives in a rural community, right? Assuming it's a small town where the community, everybody, neighbors, right? Everybody knows everybody. Everybody probably knew who Jasmine was. Yeah. All of these different systems really, really failed her when there were all of these signs, right? That something was really wrong or something more sinister was happening with Jasmine. Okay. So working with survivors. This, I think it's a difficult slide to look at for myself, even. So these are things that I've heard survivors called, or things that survivors have told me that they've been called by other victim service providers. I'll give you guys a second to maybe look through the list. addict, uncooperative, volatile, manipulative, liar. From victim service providers. So a survivor leader that I saw speak a while back has said something that really stuck with me, and it was, it's crazy to think that society put me in an environment to be trafficked and then blamed and criminalized me for how I responded to the trauma. Every organization that you work with, they're going to have, right, their trouble clients, right? The clients that are more difficult. They're the ones that get kicked out of programs for non-compliance, right? They're the ones who might get kicked out for using drugs or for getting into fights, right? Right. These are the ones where we need to lean in more, right? And we as like victims, like a nonprofit space, right, have done like a really poor job of really taking this into consideration and realizing that these are the individuals that are experiencing the most complex trauma. It's also important to keep in mind that leaving the trafficker doesn't mean that you're leaving survival mode, right? Just because a survivor has exited their trafficking situation doesn't mean that they feel safe, that they're ready to trust, that they're ready to trust you specifically, right? That they have managed with their trauma, right? Or that the control of their trafficker is gone. It's lasting, right? Where like there's a single instance of abuse, like maybe a single instance of sexual assault, that can lead to like this very acute but short-term protective response or like incident-linked dissociation. For survivors of human trafficking, it is chronic, it is automatic, and it is deeply embedded into their daily functioning, right? Human trafficking survivors are functioning within this continual trauma response. Like their normal is here, which makes it very hard to do things like critical thinking or focusing on anything in particular, right? Or even like planning for the future. It's very hard to see the future when you're here all the time. And I think it's right. I'll say it again. They've not only been traumatized by the trafficker, but by all of these different systems who've minimized them or ignored them or kicked them out of programs. So it's our job as advocates to really recognize this and understand what this means in relation to how we're going about providing services. So if you suspect trafficking, here's like your quick and dirty little 5 steps to go through. First being to acknowledge community-specific risks and invite their insight and perspectives, right? In this sense, we're letting this individual know that we're aware that certain things happen in the community. Like we're not blind to what's going on. And we're letting them know that, yeah, we're going to believe you when you say these types of things to us. And we're recognizing that you're the expert in your own life, right? Saying something like, we know systems don't work the same for everyone. What has been, your experience so far? You know your community better than anyone. Are there people or places you feel unsafe around right now, right? So really letting them know, hey, I get that these things happen. I want to hear your story and I'm going to believe you. The next is expect that survivors may test you. They are going to test you with information to see your response. They are going to test your boundaries. They're going to test your words, all of these things. And I think it's important to, and like relation to that one slide with all of those different terms that survivors have been called, like this is a survival tactic, right? To assess their safety. This is not them trying to be manipulative or rude. They're trying to see like, what are the boundaries here? What are you a safe person for me to engage with? Which means they're going to be testing you, right? To see that you're consistent, right? In the things that you're doing and saying. You then want to create a safe, judgment-free space for individuals to share concerns or experiences. Again, like I think this is one of those that is easy in theory, but can be very difficult in practice, right? This whole gray space, right? You might be working with someone who has caused harm to other people or who has a criminal record, if that, impacts how you feel about some of the things that you've done, right? It's hard, right, to be non-judgmental, and it's requires a lot of, I think, self-reflection, right? Why am I responding to this specific way? Really, really taking the time to debrief after sessions that you've had and think about, okay, am I actually being judgment free? There are things that are happening that, you know, uh, they are what they are, right? This is the reality of what the situation looks like, and we need to be able to still work with and assist these survivors. Next would be to validate and normalize their emotional responses. So you're not minimizing their experience, you're showing that their responses are superhuman, understandable, and not something to be ashamed of, right? Saying something like, sometimes our brains protect us by shutting down. That's a normal trauma response, right? Or you're not overreacting. Your body and mind are responding to this very real threat that you've lived through, right? This is real common, right? We want to make sure that they feel like they aren't crazy, right? These are normal things that people experience when they've gone through this amount of trauma. And then we want to share relevant, accessible information tailored to their specific needs. So some to-dos, right? We want to be honest, even when the truth is not ideal, even if we are trying to be like saying something because we want to comfort them, right? Or make them feel better. Traffickers lie, manipulate, gaslight, and withhold information as forms of control over these individuals. Service providers can mimic these dynamics if we're not careful, right? So we really want to make sure that we're saying things as they're happening. If we're not sure about things, we're saying that we're not sure. We never want to use these blanket statements like you're safe or you will be safe. We don't really know, right? Survivors might test whether an advocate is trustworthy before open up and engaging with services, right? They might be looking for little inconsistencies in things that you say. They might ask you a question in a couple different ways to see if your response is the same. So always be prepared to explain if something changes, explain why something changed, right? If you make a mistake, be honest about it. I think American society has like come into this space where, we look at mistakes as we try to hide them, right? Or we double down on things and get defensive. And we really, really don't want to do this in this space. I mean, you will make a mistake, working with the survivor. It's going to happen, but just be honest about it. Set boundaries and be prepared to reinforce them. So survivors may test your boundaries because they want to see how you react, right? Will you react like their trafficker or other service providers, right? Are you really a safe space, or are you going to punish me like my abuser or other service providers have? Because they're in this like heightened survival mode, right? It might be that they don't remember or fully understand a boundary that was initially set. They might have never actually engaged in any healthy relationship boundaries before. They've always had their own violated, right? And so how you respond to a tested boundary, I think, is almost as important as the boundary itself. Just be prepared to hey, I know we talked about this, just to bring it up again. I want to make sure we're on the same page, model those healthy boundaries and those healthy relationships. You want to be consistent and reliable, and you want to be like this even when the survivor is not. And they probably will not be, right? They might not show up to meetings. They might say they're going to do something that they don't do. They might not be consistent, but you need to be consistent and reliable. I think this is good, especially for individuals who are entering the space for the first time. Work on regulating our own tone and our body language and our reactions. Trafficking survivors will read you up and down, left to right. Sometimes they'll even be able to read and understand what you're feeling before you do, right? They are very, very, very sensitive to body language and tone because they've had to be as a way of survival. So, right, if you're showing like judgment, right, if you're tensing up or if you're flinching, they're going to pick up on that, right? They're going to know, and they are probably going to think maybe this isn't like a safe person for me. Also, right, survivors who like Jasmine, right, who for sure has complex PTSD, may have extreme mood swings and a lot of triggers, right? They're going to have more triggers than other individuals that you might be working with. And I think it's important to recognize that when a survivor is escalating, it is normal for your body to begin to escalate as well, right? Like sweaty palms, maybe, dry throat. I have a really bad one where my whole like chest turns red. So I'm always wearing shirts that cover that space. Um, but right, it's natural for that to happen to your body, but we need to practice like regulating and breathing and speaking slowly. I always think it's super important to within your organization to ask about like what are their de-escalation policies and protocols, right? Be prepared for these things because they're going to happen, right? And they're not catching you off guard. Prioritize survivor's choice, even if it's tiny things, right? Would you like to sit in this chair or that chair, right? Checking in as you're going through, whatever intake process or whatever conversation you're having, right? You don't have to tell me anything if you're not ready. Are you okay to keep going? Would you like a break? Right? You guys will learn a bit more about what flight, fight, and freeze look like, or you might have already. But fawn is like the fourth one in this, in trauma responses. And it's a very common trauma response for human trafficking survivors. So fawn is I'm going to comply to make this person happy so they don't hurt me. Or I want to get out of here. So I'm going to do what they say, even if I'm going to agree with what they say, even if I don't plan to do what they say. And asking for responses to like big, broad, open-ended questions can be super overwhelming when you're in survival mode. So give them a couple choices, right? Would you rather take a card, get a text, or talk to someone together now, right? Would you like to, which of these needs are your biggest priority right now? Do you need food? Do you need clothing? Do you need housing, right? Giving them some options. Notice who is around you while you're asking questions or providing resources, right? Just as much as we want to be attuned to the survivor that we're working with, we want to be attuned to who they came in with, right? How they're acting, right? Are these people trying to come back when they're getting a safe exam, right? Is the survivor constantly looking to another person, right, for them to answer for them? If you're on the phone, right, are you constantly hearing like voices in the back, right? They're muffling the phone. If you're on Zoom, do you see their eye line? Like they're constantly being distracted by someone, maybe indicating that someone else is in the room with them. You also only want to give resources to an individual directly and only when they're alone, right? So they might be monitored. They might be unable to keep printed materials, right? So make sure that you're being very careful about how you're giving information. Stay open-minded, right? Some of you might think that Jasmine's story is unrealistic, but it's really the norm, right? You might hear things, right, that you're unfamiliar with or that might sound like unrealistic, but are likely not, are actually things that have happened. And then stay present, right? Because of all of the triggers, right, that a survivor of human trafficking might have, this might mean like before a meeting with a human trafficking survivor or someone who you suspect is a human trafficking survivor, that you're taking 10 minutes before that meeting to breathe, right, and put that do not disturb on your door. This might mean, to the extent possible, not scheduling those meetings back to back or having your meetings with these clients with more triggers and trauma in the morning and during the beginning of the week when you know that we're more alert in the morning and we're more alert in the beginning of the week. And just be patient, right? Individuals will exit and re-enter the life, and they might come in and out of services. I think the thing that we can do, right, is that you have the opportunity to be maybe one of the first service providers that they can truly trust, right? Who can be a touch point for these individuals while they're trying to leave these circumstances. So, final section, resources for working with survivors. Your resource toolkit is everything. Some of you might already have one, but building it out so it includes things for trafficking, in case you're seeing it in your work, is something to keep in mind. So as you're building out this toolkit, here are some of the unique needs for survivors. to be thinking about, right? Like, who are your contacts? Do you have resources in these specific spaces? So they are going to have more complex and chronic medical concerns that need long-term care, right? They might have chronic pain. They might have chronic gastrointestinal issues, right? Things that when your body has experienced a certain level of trauma, your body can't really come back from it, right? And so they're going to need extra care in these medical spaces. They are going to have experienced polyvictimization and compounded complex trauma, right? And so this means that traditional forms of therapy might not work for them, right? They might need specialized services. They might need body-based healing modalities, right? They might need professionals who are competent in this type of extreme trauma. They are more likely to have a criminal history. They are more likely to need immigration-specific relief. They are going to need low barrier, short and long-term housing support. And long-term is really, really important for survivors. So not just like that rapid rehousing and emergency crisis management, but like, what are my options long-term, right? I need housing for a year, not just for a week, right? Or for a month. In this study, a national survivor study done by Polaris, 72% of US trafficking survivors said stable housing was the number one need for long-term recovery, right? This type of stability is needed. They are going to have more acute and ongoing safety risks from their trafficker and co-survivors, right? Stalking is extremely common when working with human trafficking survivors. They are more likely to struggle with substance abuse. They are at higher risk for self-harm and suicidal ideation. They are probably going to need assistance with gaining valid personal documentation, right? You need IDs to get benefits, right? To open a bank account, right? And so they're probably going to need assistance in these areas. They might need assistance clearing fraudulent debt or credit damage. And this isn't always a safe option depending on the type of trafficking, but sometimes support for an entire family unit can be extremely powerful and beneficial to the healing process. All right, going back to Jasmine's story. And here we go.
Even though Jasmine knows Trevor is using her, part of her still cares about him. She believes she loves him, and he keeps feeding that idea, telling her things like, "No one knows you better than I do," and "Who else would even want you?" At one point, Jasmine tries reaching out to her dad. She calls him, hoping maybe he'll help, or at least listen. However, when he picks up, he tells her he's ashamed of what she's doing. Jasmine hangs up and never calls again. She thought about going to the police, but she's scared of what Trevor might do. She also doesn't want to get Trevor in trouble. And honestly, when have the cops ever listened to her anyway? When she turns 18, Jasmine finally finds a way to leave Trevor. He doesn't take it well. He's constantly calling and texting, trying to pull her back, but she doesn't go. This means that she has no money, no place to go, and no one to help. She ends up working the streets and camming because that's what she's always done. She tries going to a few places for help, but things don't go well. She is labeled as rude, manipulative, or difficult. She is constantly on edge, quick to anger, and scared to trust anyone. Jasmine thinks the service providers are mean, and they never seem to really listen to her. Barely hanging on, Jasmine picks up the phone and calls the rape crisis hotline. She's not sure what will happen, but it's her last option.
Okay. So what we know about Jasmine, right? And through her storyline, what are some of the barriers to receiving services that you see specifically for Jasmine? Prior criminal history, so many programs, that's an automatic denial.
It's hard for her to trust too.
Hard for her to trust, right? Loss of familial support, right? She doesn't have that. Victim services, right? They don't understand the trauma responses that are happening. Being labeled difficult, Substance abuse is, yes, stigma, absolutely. She's 18 now, right? She might have aged out of some of the services that she would have been eligible before, right? We talked about her criminal record. What does that do to your options for housing, right? What does that do to your options for employment? Severe mental health, right? She absolutely has complex PTSD. Yeah, your options are just hindered. They just are. We're a pretty punitive society, right? We're not very good at giving people second chances. The dad, right? She doesn't have any sort of, Trevor might be her only support system, right? Her only person who is providing some type of support in her life at the moment, right? All of these barriers that really make her case complex show really kind of shine a light on the insidiousness of trafficking and how society has really, and systems really have failed her, right? Low credit score, absolutely. We don't know her credit. We don't even know if she has a credit score, right? We don't even know if she's even built one up to this point. This is great, everyone. Okay. So one of your biggest resources to add into your toolkit has to do with what's called the Regional Navigator Program. Yeah, we don't know if she finished school. Another great one. Um, this is a specific program that provides an individual for each county. So every single county in Maryland has a designated regional navigator that provides services, wraparound services, and referral services to youth under the age of 24 who are suspected or confirmed victims of sex trafficking and now labor trafficking as well. So it includes the both. You all are going to get, when this PDF comes out to you all, you're going to get a little rundown, like a little sheet that describes the Regional Navigator Program in more depth. And you're also going to get something that shows which organization houses the regional navigator for each jurisdiction, right? They are an invaluable resource to get in touch with, right? Even just to like let them know, hey, I'd like to talk with you about things that are happening, or they're very connected in the community, right? So even if you're working with a survivor who's over 24 or over, right? They have a lot of connections in the community to help you find the resources that you need when working with a human trafficking survivor. Next is task forces, right? There's a statewide one, and then there's a bunch of county and regional specific ones. We're starting up an Eastern Shore Human Trafficking Task Force. There's a Southern Maryland one, right? Depending on where you're working and what counties you're working in, getting on these listservs, right? I can't tell you the number of resources that I've gotten just from being added onto these listservs, right? Or the sort of training I get. Yeah, the navigators do assist victims who are incarcerated. Okay. If you want to reach out to any of these, right, or you're not sure, where to start, feel free to reach out to me. You'll get my information at the end of this presentation, and I'm happy to make the connect. Sally, right, is going to be another one, right? We provide specific legal assistance for a number of different issues, specifically for human trafficking survivors or survivors who have experienced a sexual assault as a result of their trafficking, right? So victims' rights, protection and peace orders, family law, housing, some housing issues, and immigration. So put Sally in the toolkit. Some national resources to be aware of, right? We have the National Human Trafficking Hotline, right? This is a number that can be called by a survivor, but it can also be called by you, right? If you have questions, they have a pretty extensive directory, like local state-specific directories of resources that you can gain access to. NECMEC is another huge one, right? They do a lot of work with missing children and children who have non-consensual explicit images of them online. They're a really great resource for getting that stuff taken down. The Human Trafficking Legal Center, right? If you're unable to find something locally, get in contact with the Legal Center. They have a lot of connections to legal service providers and pro bono legal service providers across the nation. And the Freedom Network USA always has really, really great trainings, great information. All of these are really good places to kind of hone in and find some more resources for your work. Peer support is huge, right? We should always be looking for more peer support resources because they are instrumental in helping to heal a survivor's trauma and to provide a little bit of that community that has been taken away from them, right? So some of your larger, more national organizations are going to be your National Survivor Network and the Survivor Alliance. Here in Maryland, we actually have something called the Luna Project. You guys are also going to get a handout that has more information specifically on the Luna Project, but this is a virtual peer community for the entire state of Maryland that's run by and for survivors. Great way to connect, pardon me. The Sex Workers Outreach Project, right? Also super, right? A survivor might not want to talk to you, but they might be willing to pick up a phone and talk to a peer, right, on this hotline. In line with hotlines, right? I think it's always important to have a good number of them on you, right? This labeling someone as a trafficking survivor can be very stigmatizing and can really push people away, right? So they might not call, like a survivor might not be willing to call the human trafficking hotline, but they might be willing to call the crisis lifeline, right? And they might be willing to call, you know, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, right? Or the Trans Lifeline. It's also really good, right, to have these little numbers because it provides this very short, easy to remember information, right? Survivors may not always be able to take a brochure or anything like that. So always have some of these kind of like in your bank to use. And then finally, internet awareness and safety, right? We know trafficking and sexual exploitation is only growing on the internet. It's only up from here, unfortunately. Thorn, who is a pretty big digital safety organization, did this study that showed that 55% of domestic minors of sex trafficking, age 7 to 11 years old, are recruited through social media apps and websites. So I'm not saying you have to be like an expert. Apps are coming out every day, but like kind of lock in and pay attention to what are some of the apps that are being used in the community that you're serving, right? Find out this information, not only as a way to like help provide digital safety planning, but also like a way to connect with survivors, right? If you know the things that they're using, they're more likely to give what you say more credence, right? And then some other have some other resources here specific to video and image removal. So NCMEC specifically for minors, but then the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative is really great when we're talking about adults, and the stopncii.org has a whole toolkit that shows how to hash or block or reach out to different platforms to remove images online if it's something that you need to actually do or help a survivor do themselves. All right. Finally, ending Jasmine's story. We're in our final section here.
After multiple interactions, Jasmine begins to feel safe enough to trust the advocate. Eventually, Jasmine agrees to accept support and is connected to a safe housing option that's somewhere Trevor can't reach her.
All right. So now that we finished with the story, right? Where do you think Jasmine's story goes from here, right? And this can be just like a reflection activity, right? You don't have to put anything in the chat. You know, maybe it's smooth sailing, but maybe exactly, Kayla, maybe she will re-enter the life, right? It's the healing process is not linear, right? It is zigzagged, circular, and goes all these different ways. So it's all part of the process, though, right? This is all part of the process for healing to take place. And finally, just to, you know, put a nice little period on all of this, you're not just offering services in your position, you're really offering like a relationship and a presence and a space for survivors to experience safety, possibly for the first time in an extremely long time. This is not just physical, but emotional and psychological and relational safety. And that's life-changing, right? To be that person who, an individual who might be trying to work through the process or trying to go through, the steps of healing or trying to get out of a situation, and knowing that they have an individual that they can contact, knowing that they can come back to you and that you're going to be non-judgmental, can be extremely life-changing. So you all, I can't even express how important you all in not only um, providing services and safety for survivors, but also in preventing future trauma from happening. And finally, here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. I respond to my emails pretty regularly. Put me in your toolkit. Always happy to chat. And good luck with the rest of your SAVAT training.
Thank you so much for that fantastic training, Mac. So I've put the evaluation form into the chat. Again, we greatly appreciate all feedback as we're constantly striving to improve. If you are seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for social work CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. If you click on that link, you'll be able to access the certificate request form. I'll be sending out a follow-up email later today with a copy of today's video recording, the PowerPoint slides, the evaluation link, and all of the resources that Max shared today. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you later this afternoon for our first skills building lab. And if you're unable to make it, then we hope to see you tomorrow morning.
Thanks, everybody.